So, welcome back to Tara Institute. My name's Damien, and I'm doing this month's Monday night, the introductory talks. And I'm lucky this month because there's 5 Mondays, so next week is my last Monday, and then Judy Main will do the month of May. And I have been talking about this statement that the practice of Buddhism is loving kindness and the view of Buddhism is dependent origination. And so loving kindness is predominantly an attitude that we have, that we can generate, and from that attitude, actions will follow. And loving kindness, in principle, is the mind of love and the mind of compassion. And talking about how love and compassion both arise from a warm, affectionate attitude towards somebody else. On the basis of that affection, we see that person lacks happiness, and so we want them to have happiness. We want them to have the happiness that they lack. So that's the mind of love. The mind of love is the mind that wishes somebody to have happiness, and in particular the happiness that they lack. And then the mind of compassion, again, towards somebody for whom there is some sort of affectionate embrace and a consideration, a care for that person. And then when we see that person enduring some suffering, we have the wish that they be free of that suffering, that suffering would end. So quite straightforward, and it's like we've been discussing. It's pretty much a natural condition of being a human that we have these attitudes. So they may not be universal attitudes. They may not be to everybody, because our field of affection is sometimes conditional and it's often limited. But still, in our mind, we have this person for whom we feel affection, and so we want them to have happiness and we want them to be free from suffering. So the only thing that Buddhism adds, in a way, is developing a love and compassion which is not conditional on my own self-interest, that is not limited by my own personal sphere of who I like and who I dislike. It's not limited or restricted to something which is just merely for my benefit. So, we have a sort of an extent of people to whom we offer love and compassion, and it's often based on various conditions. Maybe our race or our nationality or our religion or some sort of condition that we see, our relatives, family. So this is not to diminish the fact that it's love and compassion. It is still love and compassion, but it's conditional, and that conditionality sometimes does cause us to exclude people from our love and compassion and our practice of loving kindness. So certainly from a Buddhist point of view, the aim is to develop an affection for others which is unconditional, irrespective of my own self-interest. Okay, so that's one important thing. Then the second important thing is to consider what is the happiness that somebody lacks? You know, what is the happiness that somebody lacks? And similarly, what is the suffering that somebody is subject to? So here, it's not just the immediate sensory happiness that somebody might lack. So you're with your friend and you say, would you like a coffee? And you think, I think they'd really like a coffee. They're lacking a coffee. They're missing out on a coffee. Here's your coffee. And so that's an act of giving happiness, of, you know, because it's a happiness, because the person lacks a coffee. Giving them a coffee is giving them happiness. And similarly, with compassion, that somebody is suffering particularly a physical immediate suffering, a headache or something, and so you think, I want them to be free of the suffering, and so you do something to relieve them of that suffering. But what Buddhism is looking at is trying to have a much broader view of the happiness that somebody lacks, and also the suffering that somebody is undergoing. So to our mind, to our eyes, we, particularly in regard to suffering, what we see when we see suffering is what's called the suffering of suffering, that immediate sort of suffering experience. But from a Buddhist point of view, there are many other circumstances where we may perceive it as actually happiness, but in fact it is a form of suffering. And what we're doing is we are misunderstanding that circumstance, and we are then experiencing it and reacting to it in a certain way. And so that reaction to it can then cause us to do actions and to think in certain ways that actually create further suffering for ourselves. And so because we're unaware of the initial actual circumstance, the way we perceive it is incorrect. So let's talk about different types of happiness. So this is where we try to bring in these various ideas about dependent origination. So there's the dependent origin based on cause and effect, the dependent origin where an object dependently arises based on its parts, and then the dependent arising based on being merely labelled by mind. So in particular in regard to cause and effect, like we were talking about last week about the example of somebody who is the habitual liar, that the person who engages in an action, and then due to cause and effect, that action has a consequence. And so we all, unfortunately, are suffering from our previous negative actions, and we also are benefiting from our previous positive actions. And so the fact that we do not recognise or behave skillfully according to cause and effect is one of the main reasons that we lack happiness. So from a we're very fortunate that we have this human body and the human mind. We're very, very fortunate. If we just think in terms of all living beings on the earth, even if you think there's only one life, and you just look around and you start to see, I don't know what caused all this, but here I am as a human, and the garden is chock-a-block full of creatures in the soil, in the air, crawling up and down the plants, and I think my life is a lot better than their life. So you know, we are almost at a pinnacle of existence, and we don't quite appreciate that, and we certainly don't understand what the causes are that brought us to this, and we don't understand whether, okay, I like this human life. If there happens to be a future existence, then I think I'd like it to be human rather than a bug in the garden. But we don't know what the cause is to create that. So I think we have the wish for happiness for somebody, and part of our wish for happiness for that person is that I wish that they understand cause and effect, and that they are able to create the causes for their own future happiness. And not just in terms of having a coffee or having $1 million in the bank or having a pretty girlfriend, but that they have the happiness of good rebirth, that they have the happiness of a good rebirth, they have the happiness of a good future existence. So we can have that sort of affection for somebody. And similarly, if, you know, like in the case of we were talking last week about a person who is an habitual liar, that we can see that although they lie in order to try to further their own goals, you know, the reason somebody lies is that they perceive that it's to their benefit to mislead others. You know, there is a perception that it is in my benefit if I deceive and mislead somebody else. But to see that the reality is that that person is creating a cause in the future for them to be not believed, for them to be habituated to lying, and for them to suffer the various consequences of others never listening to them, not trusting them, and to then have a life where they are subject to mistrust and subject to criticism and lack of regard, and, you know, even their friendships and all this will all be undermined because of that habituation to lying. So we can have compassion for that person, that may they be free of the ignorance of not recognising cause and effect. So in particular, let's say using cause and effect, that the consequence of lying and becoming habituated to lying, that the consequence of that is just suffering for yourself. You know, no matter what short-term gain that you might think you're going to get by lying, the reality is that the consequence for you in the future will be an habituation to lying, and then a experience of people not accepting what you say, and an experience of being deceived by others. So we can have compassion for somebody based on that. And so we then, if we accept the whole concept of cyclic existence, that we are, you know, that we are somehow trapped on this wheel of infinite regression in terms of rebirth, you know, that this cycle has, you know, from a Buddhist point of view, this cycle is from beginningless time, you know. And when they talk about beginningless time, they're not just talking about the life of the universe, they're talking about way, way beyond that sort of thing, to a point where it is absolutely mind-boggling. So I mentioned the other week the idea that there's a lineage or a continuum of my physicality, you know, that, you know, my body has come from my mother and father. You know, at the time of conception, I get something from my father and I get something from my mother, and so then this forms the basis of my body. So besides the meditations of generating gratitude for that and having some sort of real thankfulness for being given this good human life because of the kindness of your parents. Besides that, we can start to look back and you think, okay, so they then had their own parents who had their own parents, and so there's this lineage of physical continuum, you know, and we can just keep tracing that continuum back. So certainly, like in the Christian belief system, that continuum goes right back to Adam and Eve, whenever that was. So independent of whether you believe in an Adam and Eve, you can see that there is a physicality continuum that goes back of the body. This is a continuum of the body. But Buddhism says there's also a continuum of the mind, and that the body is physical and the mind is non-physical. So the continuum of the mind is a different continuum to the continuum of the body. So for that reason, that in the mere fact that we can remember yesterday, and we can remember even the immediate prior moment, and we can experience the immediate successive moment, we can see that there is a moment-to-moment continuum of mind. So that moment-to-moment continuum of mind shows that in this life, I can trace that back, moment to moment, right back to the moment of conception. And so the logic goes that if every moment of my life is characterized by a moment-to-moment continuum, so also is the moment of conception. And so the moment of conception also has a prior moment of mind, just like every other moment in your life. So this is the logical basis for proposing that there is a prior life, a prior mental continuum moment. And so whatever that is, whatever type of life form that is, the proposal is that at the time of conception, the consciousness has come into the union of the egg and the sperm at the time of conception or very quickly afterwards. And so then it's actually the consciousness that enables what's the term, Chris, for the very first few moments of an egg? What's the term for the first moments of an egg and a sperm? There, you know, the first, something, yeah. Anyway, ask a doctor, they say, but okay. So anyway, so there's a bit of an argument that goes that that first collection of cells that divide, that the only reason that they continue to develop and prosper and multiply and form into a human body is because of the presence of consciousness. So this combination of the egg, the sperm and the consciousness then grows and develops, and you end up with this. But the continuum of the physicality and the continuum of the mind are different. And so whatever that prior moment of consciousness is and where it came from is, you know, you don't have to believe this. You know, this is something that is a thing to think about. But the idea is that that prior consciousness occupied another body in a different place and a different situation, and that the actions that I did at that time are carried on my continuum, and that now I can experience or may experience the results of those prior actions. So when we're wishing somebody to be happy, we can have the wish that may they continually have the fortune of a good human body, a good human life. May they have the fortune of recognising cause and effect and taking personal responsibility that whatever actions they do, whatever actions they engage in, that may they be ones that have a positive result. You know, so we can actually wish them to have actions which will have a positive future result. So we're then incorporating this dependent origination of cause and effect into our development of love for a person that we have affection for. And similarly with compassion, you know, when we see somebody, for instance, in the example of somebody suffering due to their habitual lying, and they then have suffered a terrible consequence from that habitual lying and that the results of that. And so we can have compassion. We can have a compassion that the person is carrying a vast collection of prior negativities that will ripen in suffering for that person, will ripen in unsatisfactoriness for that person. So, you know, and part of this, you know, here I'm putting forward this as a meditation. You know, this is sort of a meditative consideration, and I'm putting it forward for you thinking about somebody else being subject to these problems. You know, we're thinking about somebody else being subject to this collection of problems. But the reality is, I am also subject to this collection of problems. And so I think sometimes initially it can be easier to see the problems that somebody else faces rather than have the honesty and the courage to see within yourself the negative habituations that you carry and the negativity and the sort of negative actions that we engage in, and then honestly sort of accepting, well, I have just stolen this, or I've just lied to this person, I've just cheated this person, I've just wiped up these 10,000 ants without a thought, and then sort of actually recognising that these actions may have a consequence that is unpleasant for me. So, but here we're talking about generating love and compassion for others. So we're using the same thing that actually applies to me. You know, this applies to me, and I'm using that same circumstance and looking at others and wishing that they do not create negative actions. They do not have to suffer negative consequences. And so we're generating love and compassion based here on this understanding of cause and effect. So the dependent origination of cause and effect is enabling us to deepen our love and compassion for others. All right. So then just to talk briefly about the dependent arising based on parts. So I think some of these topics we need to consider them as a journey of understanding. And some of you that have sort of read some of the different philosophical texts, you'll see that the depth of complexity in understanding some of these topics is very great. So just here to talk about understanding what it means to be based on parts. So let's take the example of this table, this nice red table. So what I'd like you to do is just comprehend the table. So in your mind, you can look at it, and in your mind you can think, the table, that's the table. So an identity, we can see that the table has an identity. And we know that, like if I teach tonight and then I go home and I come back next week, I can walk in here, I can look around and say, there's the table. You know, an identity. So just to be very clear, I mean, it might sound frivolous, but just to be really clear in your mind, identity. It's a thing. You know, this is an existent, a thing, a very definite thing. It's a table. Okay? Definite, existent. There, on the middle of the floor, there it is. So when we then start to talk about it being dependent on its parts, okay, so first thing is to clarify in your mind that when you look at the table, you're looking at the table in an unanalyzed way. It's just the table. Just the table. And so it sort of forms an identity in your mind that you are experiencing. That's the table. But if we then start looking at the parts and we see it's got 4 legs, one of them's broken here, there's a bunch of screws holding it together. Originally it was black, and then somebody some years ago painted it red, but they didn't sand it when they painted it, and so you get little bits of black showing through the red paint. It's wood. Probably the legs came from a tree somewhere or other. The tabletop has come from a couple of planks joined together. I don't know who made it, but it's been around a long time. And I'm not sure if it was here when the nuns used to be here, or whether we took it from St Kilda when we moved here, and this leg's a bit shaky. And so we can look at all the parts. So we can start looking at the parts. You know, there's the 4 legs, there's this broken one, there's the thing, there's the tabletop. And then if you think, where then is the table? Because the table is not the paint, it's not the tabletop, it's not the 4 legs, it's not the screws. It's, you know, it's none of those things. So when you analyse and start to look, you find that you cannot find the table, because, you know, you can see that there's the parts. And so then you say, all right, so the table arises in dependence upon the parts. It arises in dependence upon the parts. But if you try to find it in the parts, you cannot find it. So what this leads us, you sort of think, why would he do this to me? Why would somebody sort of make this so complicated? Because when we walk in, we just see the table and we think, there's the table. But when we analyse and we think about it in being in dependence upon its parts, we see that if we look at the parts, we can see that, you know, we've got 4 legs, but the legs aren't the table. We've got the top, but the top is not the table. The paint, we've got black paint and we've got red paint, but the paint is not the table. So you might think this is sort of frivolous and just a fake construction, but the reality, if we think about it like this, you think, well, no, the table is not there. So this idea of dependent origination is that our identity of the table, the identity of the table, and we're very certain when we walk in, we say, there's the table. But that identity of the table is dependently arising on the basis of the parts. So partly we would then say, why do this? You know, why do this? Why do this analysis? And the reason is that in the way that we act and the way that we interact with others, our biggest problem is about the way we view I, me. And we have this very strong sense of I as this very strong fixed identity, something very definite. And furthermore, when we see others, we similarly have a very definite view of others. You know, this person is my enemy. And so we have this sort of very strong, definite identification of people and things. And on the basis of that very strong identification, we generate emotions like lust or anger or hatred or jealousy. We see circumstances in a way where we conceive of them as something very definite. And on the basis of that definiteness, we then generate anger, hatred, pride, arrogance, superiority, competitiveness, lust, desire, resentment. We generate all these things. And the reason that those emotions are so strong in us is because we are so definite about that person, that circumstance, and me. My rights, my circumstance, my hurt, my pride, my anger, this very strong my sense of I and mine. So the reason then we talk about the dependent origination is, and why we might meditate on it, is to try to weaken this definiteness that we suffer from. That the occurrence of anger is determined on seeing somebody as your enemy and seeing and feeling a hurt, an insult, a loss, a negativity from perceiving that person. And this is based on this sense of definiteness about myself and about the person and about the circumstance. So the reason then that we might consider, something like the dependent origination based on cause and effect, the dependent origination based on parts, and the dependent origination based on labelled by mind, is to understand that this definiteness is mistaken. It's mistaken. And so we are actually generating all of these negative emotions on the basis of a very mistaken perception. And it's so much of Buddhist philosophy is all aimed at trying to understand those mistaken perceptions that we have. How we are getting it wrong in the way we perceive the world. And the consequences of that are that we suffer from anger, hatred, lust, pride, arrogance, competitiveness, jealousy, miserliness. All of these things are a consequence of that mistaken understanding. So I think in terms of this topic, I think we have to perceive this, the understanding of this topic, particularly as a journey. It's a journey of, over many years, of trying to refine our understanding, deepen our understanding, to read, to listen, to study, to contemplate, and trying to see the implications of this process in terms of our own life experience. So, it's not necessarily something that you can understand in a week or a day or an hour, but to treat it as a journey of initially not accepting it, and then over a period of time, maybe it's right, maybe it's not right, and then steadily moving towards some belief that it's correct. But it is a journey of comprehension that takes time. So let's do some meditation. Can I ask if there's anybody here for the first time tonight? Good, thanks. Welcome. So, have you done any meditation before? Oh, Wednesday. So great. Oh, there, good. And you also you've meditated, yeah. Okay, so just adopt a good posture, and primarily a good posture means keeping your back straight, so that whatever energy is in our body, that is unobstructed and can move freely. So having a straight back helps that. And the position of your head, you can experiment just, with your head. When you sit sort of symmetric. And you can, if you just experiment tilting your head down, and then gradually tilting your head up, I think you'll be able to feel that if your head is too far down, that you start to feel a dullness. And if your head is too far up, you start to feel a lightness, a bit of excitement, a sort of a little bit too light. So to find a position with your head so that you're neither dull nor excessively bright in your mental experience. So that's something to play around with at home, just the way your body feels the different positions and the symmetry of your body. So you might also experiment a little bit with just moving your body slightly left to right, feeling a position that seems very central for your energy. It can be a little bit off dead vertical, but just sort of experimenting with the feeling in your body about being balanced and calm. So putting your body in that position, then bring your mind completely within yourself. And let all of the thoughts go, and keep doing that until there are no thoughts in your mind, and then turn your attention onto the breath, and in particular onto the awareness of the breath coming in and going out. Just focusing on that ebb and flow of the breath, the awareness of that. Let's do that for a few minutes. So you can just relax your concentration a little bit and reflect on what happened in your meditation. So sometimes you can feel your mind being pulled towards a distraction. You know, it's sort of like the distraction is demanding your mental attention. And so when we meditate, we need to be very determined that for the period of the meditation we're going to keep the concentration just on, in this case, just on the breath. But we can feel there's, if you hear a distraction or there's something, a thought pops into your head, something that you didn't meant to do today, you haven't done it today. And so you can feel the pull of that distraction, pulling your mental attention to that distraction. So in the meditation, we need to resist that pull of distraction, to keep our focus just 100% on the chosen object of the meditation. So let's just repeat that whole process again for a few minutes, with a strong determination to resist any distraction and to keep your focus just completely on the breath. Just relax your concentration a little bit. Now, I'd like to sort of visualize in front of you, maybe somebody quite close to you, somebody that you have this like warm affection for, maybe a few people or a lot, depending on how you want to do the meditation, but certainly somebody that is, for whom you have a warm, affectionate feeling. And so we're going to meditate on love and compassion for that person. So wishing for them to have happiness, and a happiness that they lack. So wishing for them to have that happiness, and wishing them to be free of suffering, and in particular a suffering that they actually have, a suffering that they are experiencing, and then having the wish that they be free of that suffering. So initially do this meditation just on that superficiality of simple happiness, you know, what we might just regularly think as simple happiness, and so in the suffering, the obvious suffering, that wish that they be free of that suffering, the physical, particularly mental immediate suffering, physical immediate suffering. So do that part of the meditation initially, and then try to develop a feeling for their happiness of, you know, that they lack the happiness of, let's say, having the causes for a good future life, that they lack that. and also that they're suffering from the misapprehension, for instance, of what's called the suffering of change, the sort of worldly happiness, which is actually just the cessation of a previous unsatisfactory moment, and that we perceive that cessation of the previous unsatisfactory moment, we perceive it as being the happiness of a new experience. We perceive that the new experience is happiness, but it's merely the cessation of a previously unsatisfactory circumstance. And so what we perceive as normal happiness is merely just a sequence of the ending of various unsatisfactory experiences. So just sort of trying to broaden your understanding of what happiness we lack, and to broaden your understanding of what suffering we undergo, and then incorporating that understanding into our affection for somebody else, and the wish that they be happy, and the wish that they be free from suffering. So initially just do the sort of obvious happiness that somebody lacks, and the obvious suffering that somebody undergoes, and then repeat the meditation, but trying to incorporate some of these deeper recognition of the happiness that we lack and the suffering that we undergo. Let's just do that for a few minutes, using your own mental power to analyse and contemplate this circumstance. Okay, and we can relax that there. So we've got time for some questions or discussion, if anybody would like to say anything. Look, before I answer that, look, very strongly I feel this sort of point of view that people should be able to come in here and just totally relax and listen to whoever's talking and take that on board or not take it on board or whatever, but without feeling any pressure to have to do this or do that. And we aren't, Buddhism is not particularly a proselytizing sort of religion, let's say, call it a religion. So I think it's important that people can feel comfortable to come in without having to do anything. It's good to show a bit of respect by sort of sitting and, turning your phone off and this sort of thing. But I think it's important that people are welcome here without any pressure. But what you're referring to is prostration, So prostration is a cultural, historical practice. I think would come from the time of the Buddha, and I'd say it was already in Hindu tradition prior to the Buddha. So, but in the Buddhist tradition is that we stand and we touch our crown here and our throat and our heart. So this is, we consider this to be the centre of the body and the centre of the speech and the centre of the mind. So when we do this, so your hands, you know, they're not flat. They couple a space, and there's all sorts of symbolism about that idea. But it's you know, the two hands embodying, encompassing a space. But anyway, so crown, throat, heart, body, speech and mind, and then you go down and it's called touching the 5 points. So your knees, your hands and your forehead, you touch your forehead to the floor. So you touch your forehead to the floor, and mentally you're thinking, I take refuge in the Buddha. You know, you're thinking that you're taking refuge in the Buddha, and this is a sign of homage in that. And then you rise up fairly quickly. So there's symbolism of thinking that you're going down into suffering, and then you're rising up quickly. And so you rise up quickly, and then you imagine that from the Buddha, visualized Buddha, that from the Buddha's crown, throat and heart, that rays of light come and bless you. You know, they enter your crown, throat and heart. You know, so there's a vast sort of description of different things to do. But I think as a normal prostration, you go down, you prostrate with a feeling of trust and homage, let's say, and then you rise up and you touch again your crown, throat and heart, and you imagine that you're blessed, your body, speech and mind is blessed by the Buddha. And so it's... and you'll see there'll be people will do thousands and thousands of prostrations, you know, with this sort of mentality. So then there is a visualization that you can do, and there's a nungne, there's a practice called the nungne practice, and there's actually a nungne coming up in a few weeks. So you'll see there's a notice on the notice board about that. So in the nungne in particular, you do lots and lots of prostrations. I haven't done a nungne for more than 20 years, but in the days when I was young and fit, I used to do I've done a few nungnes. And in the nungne you do various sessions of prostrations, quite a lot. And one of the visualizations that you try to do is that when you go down, you prostrate down on the ground, and you imagine that you're scooping up all of the suffering beings from the lower realms. You're trying to pull them up with you, you know. So you generate that mind of thinking that you're gathering up the suffering beings and trying to lift them up out of the suffering. So there are a lot of visualizations you can do when you're doing prostrations, and so it's quite a practice. But when people come in, you know, if they're physically able, they'll go down and do a thing, or they might just touch their 3 points, you know. But it's sort of trying to remember the qualities of the Buddha. So when you do it, you're trying to remember the qualities of the Buddha and feeling that you're getting some blessing from those qualities. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is whether, you know, this is a Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Look, that's possibly another method of visualising the blessing, you know. But I think in general, I think if you're prostrating to the Buddha, visualisation of the Buddha, you're not particularly prostrating to the statue, you know, although it looks like that, but you're prostrating to the Buddha's qualities, you know. But look, there are other, So, and white, red, and blue as well. The colours of the, if you can do that. So these points, they're said to be like an elemental energy or point here. White in colour, and at your throat there's sort of like an elemental essence of speech, which is red, and at your heart an elemental sense of mind or mentality, which is blue. Very small. So, and then, there's lots of different visualizations in regard to that as well. But look, and you can choose to do them yourself. And that's why I say, look, I think one of the beauties of Tara Institute is that anybody is welcome, and you can, that you come here with whatever faith you have or whatever faith you don't have, and we'd like to hope you're completely welcome to be here and feel comfortable. So, Okay, flooded with questions. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think maybe it's too much to think about, but so next week I will continue on for the 5th week, and please come back if you're able. And there's some cake and cup of tea and coffee on that up in the dining room if you're able to stay. So thank you very much.